I went into art school and I was trained in abstract expressionism. It was the 1970s, that's the way people were trained. I learned the gesture is an important mark. I learned about color and op art theories, so I got good color theory. And when I was graduating, it was a big celebration. The family came together, and my grandmother, she said to me in Spanish, "It's okay, mija, what do you do?" So I showed her this portfolio, and for the first time I saw it through her eyes. And then I realized it had no meaning. Had no meaning to her. I was actually perfectly equipped to speak to nobody I knew. So I actually began to think quite differently about my art. And very quickly, the works began to be narrative. And they began to tell stories that were our stories, ones that had never been told. And they began to be scaled. And they began to take up space. And they began to make powerful statements about a new thought about who we were. She wasn't alive to see the first mural that I did, which was a portrait of her. It was not an exact portrait, but it was a giant bandshell in Boyle Heights in Hollenbeck Park, in which her arms are outstretched in a circular bandshell space called Mi Abuelita. Don't you think we can go from that white smoke and this almost like skywriting?
Right.
And then then you go to snow.
Yeah.
We are, at this moment, working on two segments of the Great Wall. We have completed all the way from prehistory to the 1950s in a half-a-mile-long mural. We're constructing the history of the 1960s and the 1970s. We're looking at underrepresented events of an interpretation of a time from the perspective of young people, from the perspective of women, from the perspective of Native Americans, from the perspective of Latinos. Remember, every time you're looking at this thing, it's 10 feet. And we're looking at 3 feet below. Your viewers are 70 feet across. That guy has a baby in his arms.
Yeah.
You know,
Right.
They're occupying Alcatraz, and they have their families with them. Starting at 1970 and 71, I was the director of the City of Los Angeles mural program, and the Army Corps of Engineers called me up one day and said, "You know, we have just completed our building project." The Army Corps of Engineers had been systematically concreting the rivers of Los Angeles. What they had was a reach of what they called the Tujunga Wash. It was an area that they wanted to create a park along. And so I thought, wow. And I said, here's what I want to do. I want to bring kids from all these different places. I want to create one mural that's a narrative work, and I want it to be on the history of California. Now, mind you, nobody in the arts thought this was art. They thought I was a gang member first, and then they thought I was a gang worker, and then I was a teacher. But none of them basically said, this is actually an artwork that is a conceptual work that has at its nature the transformation economically and culturally and spiritually to people of this community. The first 1,000 feet of the Great Wall was done all in one summer. I hired 10 artists to work with me, and I gave each artist 100 feet to design and 10 kids to work on each of those crews. It was very difficult for it to have any continuity. So after the first 1,000 feet is what I think becomes a real mural. I've gone to the Taller Siqueiros, and I've actually learned about compositional designing into architecture and transformed the way the work has been done. These guys should be here. I think you should make Alcatraz be really large.
Okay.
And
The lines that surround the images are divided up into golden ratio. The divisions of space are actually based on the Fibonacci sequence. So what it lets us do is create these dynamic relationships across long sections of the mural. What this is representing is 30 linear feet, but the mural that we're actually working with is 360 linear feet. So some of those lines could actually pin down the composition across that entire decade. So we look for really important movements in the drawings, and it also helps us by inspiring something else, another composition maybe. Or it helps us even transition from one particular segment to another.
I mean, we would have to do hundreds of drawings just to take a look at this. And now we can take a look at it this way and then actually finalize with compositional intent. Okay.
So what do you think? Is it good to
I
print?
like it a lot. I think that's a good start. Let's take it to print and let's do some drawing on it.
As you go in, you can fill those in. So this would be quinacridone. Perfect. Part of our process has been really an extension of the methodology that Judy came up with in the Great Wall of Los Angeles project, in which we work in relationship to the experiences and historical context of a community. And we incorporate their work and their stories, their oral histories, their ideas, and we elevate them into public artworks. Our legacy of these works, both in how we're trained as artists and also in how we think of what art could do in community. This is really, in many ways, connected to the tradition of Los Tres Grandes, the Mexican muralists.
When I stood on the banks of the river, I began to imagine that if you could disappear the river, how much easier was it to disappear the stories of the people? And as I began to look at history, I had begun to see that we had at our very base a story that had never been told. Reuben gets murdered. And that, in fact, it was systematically disappeared. That image is really important.
He's holding it next to...
That's got to go right here somewhere. Where? The last 1,740 feet are the best works. They become more complex, it becomes funnier. I find my sense of humor in the process because the history of race in America is really tough to look at. And I didn't want this really terrible story. I wanted to look at what was the triumphs of people over really adverse circumstances. What was the truth? Tell the truth. But at the same time, see how people transformed their lives, regardless of what circumstances they came out of. And that was really the story of the Great Wall. I have an idea. We run a perspective point somewhere, maybe
Right.
here, and going out to these points.
Mm-hmm. Well, then maybe we take it and we hit this mark here.
That will
Right.
carry us across.
Somewhere like here.
and line,
Oh, and look
line
at
up
that.
our body, yep.
Yep.
Then that's all of a sudden snaps in. These will go into renderings, and then they'll be refined, and then they'll become blueprints, and then they will become colorations, and then they will become what becomes the mural. Long process. The relationship between the U.S. and Mexico is ongoing. The story that goes back and forth, flows back and forth across this line for centuries. We're mutually dependent. And I actually think it's so important for us as artists to visualize for people the connectedness between us. And maybe that's what my work, all of my work has been about. The connectedness between us as peoples, a place, and that memory resides in the land. All you have to do is learn to hear it, to put your ear to the ground, and it comes right up out of the ground.